Welcome to the debate. Today, we are examining a case that, well, it really plummeted the absolute depths of human depravity.
It's really did. It is incredibly grim material.
Yeah, it is. We are looking at the horrifying violence of Fred and Rosemary West. And, imagine for a moment projecting the image of a perfectly normal, functioning family to your neighbors.
Right, just going about the daily routine of domestic life, waving to people on the street.
Exactly. But the foundation of your actual home, the very floorboards you walk on and the garden you tend, is quite literally built over a private graveyard of your own creation.
It is a terrifying juxtaposition. And when you look at how a nightmare like that comes to exist, it actually reminds me of how structural engineers examine a catastrophic building collapse.
Oh, how so?
Well, when they finally stand there, staring at the rubble, they face a very specific analytical problem regarding causality. Do you blame the original foundational concrete because it was poured years ago with, invisible microfractures?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you blame the subsequent architectural addition, the sheer unprecedented weight of a new structure built on top of it that eventually dragged the entire edifice down into the earth?
That is a fascinating way to frame it. Because the central tension we want to unpack today is exactly that structural question. How do we parse the true mechanics of this violence?
Right, because we are talking about a couple operating in tandem here. They were officially charged with 12 killings, though, estimates suggest that number is significantly higher.
Much higher, yeah. They assaulted and murdered at least 9 people strictly as a team. So, do we view this through a criminological lens, focusing on Fred West's pre-existing pathology and his individual driving need for ultimate control?
Or do we examine this through a historical and sociological lens, understanding that the unique synergy of their partnership, the environment they created together, was the actual catalyst for the massive scale of these atrocities?
Exactly. Now, I approach this as a criminologist, and my position is that Fred West was the central controlling architect of this violence.
Okay.
The fundamental load-bearing pillar of this entire horrific enterprise is the historical reality that Fred had already murdered in the past, long before he ever even met Rosemary.
He did have that history, yes.
Right, so he did not need her to cross the ultimate psychological threshold of taking a human life. To return to your opening analogy, Fred had already drawn the blueprint for murder.
Mm-hmm.
He had already poured that rotten foundation. Rosemary simply became the contractor who helped him build upon it. The violence was scaled up, sure, but the foundational pathology, the driving mechanism, belongs entirely to Fred.
Well, I come at it from a different way. As a historian looking at the timeline, I have to focus on what happens when these two specific individuals intersect.
Okay, go on.
Criminological history shows us that while rare, serial predators occasionally operate in pairs. And when Fred and Rosemary joined forces, a fundamental paradigm shift occurred.
You think the dynamic completely changed?
Absolutely. We are no longer looking at an isolated killer with a past. We are looking at a shared engine of depravity. Consider the profound turning point here. Rosemary's purportedly first victim was Fred's own stepdaughter.
Right. Charmaine?
Yes. That is the exact moment the violence turned inward on their own family unit. It acted as the ignition for an additional 9 shared victims.
But
Just to finish the thought, Rosemary was not merely a contractor following a blueprint. Her arrival fundamentally altered the nature of the crimes, transforming them from isolated incidents into a highly systematic, collaborative rampage.
well, I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on that turning point. You are looking at the volume of the collaborative rampage, right? The fact that they went on to kill at least 9 people together.
Exactly. The scale is unprecedented.
It is, but we have to look closer at the how and why of the specific victimology you just raised, because I argue that the choice of those early victims actually reinforces Fred's individual need for total dominance.
Wait, how so?
Well, it does not prove a shared, equitable project of violence. Look at who they targeted.
We are talking about them specifically targeting Fred's first wife, Catherine Costello, his stepdaughter, and eventually the couple's own biological daughter, Heather West.
Exactly.
But, in the annals of violent crime,
Targeting one's own family unit to that degree is a distinct historical aberration. It is not standard behavior.
It is an aberration, absolutely, but look at the psychological utility of it for Fred.
Usually, serial predators seek external targets to avoid detection. They hunt strangers. The fact that Fred and Rosemary turned their own home into an active killing ground for their blood relatives suggests a deeply toxic, shared psychological echo chamber.
A shared chamber, sure, but
The normal boundaries of family were completely obliterated by the partnership itself. They normalized this violence for each other.
let's break down who those first internal targets actually were. Fred's first wife, Fred's stepdaughter.
Right.
From a criminological standpoint, killing your ex-wife and your stepdaughter is not the hallmark of a new couple embarking on a collaborative mission. It reads as Fred methodically eliminating his personal pre-existing familial ties.
You think it was that calculated?
I do. This is a classic indicator of an individual attempting to maintain absolute unilateral control over his environment by essentially wiping the slate clean.
Wiping the slate clean. That is a very clinical way to look at it.
Yes, but it fits the pathology. He is systematically removing anyone who might challenge his authority, remind him of his past, or complicate the narrative he wants to build in his current home. He wants to be the absolute god of his domestic universe. Rosemary may have participated, absolutely, but the targets themselves reflect Fred's psychological housekeeping. He was clearing out his old life.
I have to say, I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that, and let me tell you why.
All right?
If this were purely Fred's psychological housekeeping, as you call it, he could have done that on his own. We established you had murdered before meeting her.
He did.
Right, so he possessed the capacity for solitary violence. But he didn't do it alone this time. He involved Rosemary. And Rosemary's participation in the murder of her predecessor, Catherine, and her stepdaughter, is the very ritual that binds them together.
But she's participating in his agenda. The targets were his.
Initially, perhaps you could argue that, but look at the trajectory of the violence. The culmination of that internal family violence wasn't just erasing Fred's past. It was the murder of their own daughter, Heather West.
Yes, in 1987.
That completely shatters the wiping the slate clean theory, doesn't it? Killing the daughter they shared is not Fred cleaning up his past. That is the partnership actively consuming its own present.
It is the ultimate taboo, I will grant you that.
Exactly. And to breach that ultimate taboo requires an environment where both individuals have completely divorced themselves from standard human biology and empathy.
Right.
It demonstrates that the team dynamic itself, that folie à deux, had become the primary driver, superseding any individual biological instinct or prior attachment.
It is a terrifying escalation.
Because you don't normalize killing your own child over breakfast, unless the person sitting across the table from you is reinforcing that reality. The violence required the partnership to reach that level of domestic horror.
Well, that brings up a fascinating point about the physical reality of their domestic life. How do you normalize that environment? Because this boundary obliteration didn't just stop at the act of murder.
No, it permeated everything.
It extended directly into how they lived with the aftermath. They didn't dump these bodies in the woods or a river. They kept them on their property, which leads us to the deeply psychological motive behind where these victims ended up.
You are talking about the burials on the properties.
Yes, I argue that the physical placement of these victims provides the ultimate proof of Fred's overarching unilateral control of the entire enterprise.
Really? Because I look at that entirely differently.
How so?
I view the burials on the properties as a distinctly practical consequence of their partnership. Think about the logistics for a second.
Okay, logistics.
When you have two people actively assaulting and killing multiple victims, again, at least 9 people together, the logistics of concealment become exponentially more complicated. They aren't isolated. They are operating as a known unit.
But why risk keeping them so close? That seems incredibly reckless.
Because it was a mutual defense mechanism. Burying victims under the floorboards and in the garden was a structural necessity for a killing team. It was a way for the couple to tightly control the physical evidence of their shared rampage.
I see where you are going, but
Because think about it, if Fred puts a body in a car and drives it out to the country, he risks being pulled over. He risks exposing Rosemary to law enforcement.
that is true.
And if Rosemary transports a body, she risks exposing Fred. By keeping the victims on their shared property, neither partner had to risk external exposure. They created an impenetrable fortress of shared guilt.
Well, I am not convinced by that line of reasoning, mostly because it focuses purely on the logistical and entirely ignores the deeply psychological motive that drives this specific type of offender.
You think it was purely psychological?
Yes, this was not merely a practical solution to hide bodies from the police. Fred wanted access. He wanted to feel that he could actually be part of this area, that he could interact with it daily. This was his private graveyard.
But they were buried on their properties. Plural. It was a shared space. They both lived there.
The properties were shared in name, and yes, she lived there. But the psychological utility of that graveyard was entirely Fred's. Think of the mechanism of a macabre museum curator.
A museum curator? That is an intense analogy.
Exactly. Because a curator doesn't just store priceless artifacts in a dark vault solely to hide them from thieves. They arrange them in a highly specific location so they can continually visit them.
Right.
They observe them and derive ongoing satisfaction from them. That is how a control-oriented killer operates. Fred burying the victims on the property wasn't just about hiding them. It was about maintaining physical and psychological proximity to his kills.
To relive the power.
Precisely. It allowed him to exert perpetual ownership over the dead. The practical element of hiding them from the police was vastly secondary to his primary psychological need for absolute access. He was building a monument to his own power, quite literally under the feet of his family. He knew it was under the floorboards while everyone else just walked over them. That is the ultimate expression of control.
That's a compelling argument regarding his psychology, I will admit. But have you considered how the dynamic of a private graveyard actually functions for the other person living in that house?
You mean Rosemary?
Yes. If we accept your analogy that this is Fred's museum, we must also acknowledge that Rosemary lived in it, walked over it, and actively contributed to it. A museum requires a staff, doesn't it?
It does, but a staff takes orders from the director.
But look at the sheer audacity of it. Burying 12 people around a lived-in property isn't a passive act. It requires the active, daily complicity of the partner.
Of course.
You cannot maintain a private graveyard in plain sight without the other half of the couple providing cover, normalizing the environment, and helping to manage the horrific physical reality of what they had done.
The physical maintenance.
Think about the smells. Think about the excavation work. The access may have been Fred's primary desire, but the execution and the daily maintenance of that graveyard was a shared operational burden.
They certainly presented a unified front to the outside world. I can't deny that.
They had to. It's why the authorities eventually zeroed in on them. When the police finally started looking closely, it was initially an investigation into assault charges against the couple.
Right, the 1992 charges.
Exactly. The community, the surviving victims, the authorities, they all perceived them as an inseparable unit of violence. The graveyard only worked because they operated as a unified front against the outside world.
They were perceived as a unit externally. I will grant you that. But the internal reality of that unit, who actually held the reins, is revealed at the very end of the narrative.
You think so?
I do. Let us look at how this unprecedented crime spree finally concluded, because I think how it ends tells us everything about how it operated.
You mean the arrests? When the police finally excavated the house?
I mean, what happened in 1995? Before he could even stand trial, Fred West took his own life. This forces us to examine the ultimate question of control.
It certainly forces us to look at the fallout, because the result of that suicide left Rosemary to face the legal and structural consequences of their shared crimes entirely alone.
She did face trial alone, yes.
She was the one who went to court. She was sentenced to life in prison. To me, this outcome highlights exactly how deeply intertwined their enterprise was.
How so?
They built this massive architecture of violence together, and when it finally collapsed under the weight of the police investigation, the surviving partner was left holding the entirety of the ruin. She was intrinsically tied to those bodies. She couldn't just walk away because Fred was gone.
But look at how he left her holding that ruin. By taking his own life, Fred unilaterally decided the ending. He was in control right to the very end.
I don't know about that. Taking your own life to avoid prison is a desperate act, not necessarily a masterstroke of control.
Well, I would argue it's the absolute pinnacle of control for an abuser and a serial killer. Let's really analyze the mechanism here.
Okay.
If this was truly a balanced shared partnership, if the engine of this depravity was genuinely collaborative, why does one partner hold the ultimate veto power over justice?
I see what you were getting at.
By committing suicide, Fred circumvented the trial. He circumvented the authorities. But most importantly, he circumvented any narrative that Rosemary might have presented in court.
He silenced her defense.
Exactly. In a joint trial, she could have testified against him. She could have shifted blame, painted a different picture of the power dynamics.
Right.
By removing himself from the board, he froze the narrative exactly where he wanted it. He authored the final chapter of their story entirely by himself. He used suicide as his final, ultimate mechanism of control, permanently depriving her of a voice and proving that he was the paramount architect all along.
I look at that 1995 suicide through a very different lens. I just don't see it as proof of Fred's unilateral architectural genius. I see it as the final coward's exit from a collapsing joint venture.
But he dictated the terms of that exit. That is the key.
Yes, he maintained control over his own biology at the very end. I won't dispute that. But think about it like this. That's just him hitting the eject button on a plane they both flew into the side of a mountain.
That is quite an image.
The fact remains that his actions resulted in his partner receiving a life sentence for crimes they committed together.
Because she was complicit in his design.
Because the legacy of the Wests is not just Fred taking his own life in a cell. The true legacy is the staggering body count they amassed as a pair.
12 confirmed victims.
At least 12, officially. He couldn't have achieved that incredible scale of violence on his own. He couldn't have maintained that private graveyard without raising immediate suspicion.
Well,
And he certainly couldn't have seamlessly preyed upon his own family members for years without the indispensable engine of that partnership running cover for him. The suicide wasn't the defining act of control. It was merely the period at the end of a very long, very collaborative sentence.
it is a profound divergence in how we interpret the exact same set of surviving evidence. And it really highlights the difficulty of parsing a tragedy of this density.
It really does, because depending on where you stand in the rubble, the cause of the collapse looks entirely different.
Right. From my criminological framework, the timeline remains the ultimate truth teller here. Fred possessed the pathology first. The psychological barrier to murder was broken long before Rosemary entered the picture. He drew the blueprint. He then selected victims that systematically eliminated his past ties. His first wife, his stepdaughter, clearing the board for his own absolute rule. He curated a private graveyard specifically for his own psychological access, relishing the power of walking over his victims.
Right.
And when the walls finally closed in, he exercised the ultimate unilateral control by ending his own life in 1995, denying everyone, including his partner, the chance to hold him accountable. He poured the foundation, and he was the one who ultimately imploded the building on his own terms.
And from my historical framework, I maintain that a blueprint is just a piece of paper until someone actually helps you build it.
Fair point.
The isolated violence of Fred's past was transformed into something entirely unprecedented the moment Rosemary's involvement began. That is the true catalyst. Starting with the stepdaughter and ending with the horrific taboo of their own biological child, they plumbed the depths of human depravity because they operated as a pair.
Yeah.
The daily normalization of violence within that home, sitting down for tea while knowing bodies are buried under the floorboards, it points to a terrifying multiplier effect. They were a mutual defense mechanism. The partnership itself was the essential mechanism that allowed this tragedy to scale to such horrific proportions.
It is a grim reality that we must acknowledge, and it's certainly an area where our perspectives firmly converge. Regardless of whether one views Fred as the singular manipulative psychological driver or views the partnership as the essential synergistic sociological engine, the resulting collaboration allowed them to assault and kill at an astonishing scale.
Yes.
They successfully hid a private graveyard in plain sight.
They lived out a nightmare of their own design while projecting the illusion of a functioning household to the outside world. That is the chilling fact we are left with.
Precisely. The tragedy is ultimately measured in the lives of those 12 confirmed victims and the unknown others who are estimated to have been lost to that house. It is a stark reminder of how complex and multifaceted human depravity can be when it is allowed to take root, normalize itself, and flourish behind closed doors.
Examining atrocities of this magnitude requires us to grapple with both the micro and the macro. We have to understand the individual behavioral models, the pre-existing darkness, the desperate, unyielding need for psychological access and control that someone like Fred possessed.
But we also have to understand the collaborative historical frameworks you've outlined, the terrifying multiplier effect of two distinct pathologies intertwining, validating each other, and pushing the boundaries of violence farther than either individual might have gone alone.
It proves that finding the truth in the rubble of such an immense tragedy is never as simple as pointing to a single point of failure.
Exactly. It brings us right back to our starting point. When you are staring at a structural collapse of this magnitude, was it the deeply flawed, fractured foundation that had been quietly waiting in the earth? Or was it the unprecedented shared weight of the structure built on top of it that finally pulled everything down into the dark? The evidence is there for you to weigh. Thank you for joining us on the debate.